This is pretty freaky. It feels
Yeah.
like playing God a little bit, because
Yeah.
you're talking about how matter even comes to form or something in the
Right.
first place.
Another aspect would be, for example, the ability, for example, as we see with Dr. Hal Puthoff's invention, where he's using vector and scalar potentials to communicate. That would be an extreme breakthrough and revolution. Another example would be the work of Sal Paez, for example, in which you see that you could have craft that could basically be a transmedium type craft that could go through water, air, etc., without, as if the water, air didn't exist, because the field around the craft itself is voiding the reality of space-time itself, as controversial as that is.
So free energy, building real UFOs, basically,
Right.
like exotic propulsion to the limit,
Right.
and then exotic communications as well.
Correct.
That traverses space-time and
even healing medical aspects that are, again, for example, sorry to cut you off, but Luc Montagnier, his DNA water teleportation paper.
Do you believe that? Because I've always found that. So this is, by the way, French Nobel Prize winner who discovered the genome for HIV.
Right.
And so he was lauded for that. After that, in his career, he started getting into some really interesting, trippy ideas, one of which was that there are these aqueous nanostructures in DNA that involve communication, semantic communication, transfer, and storage, basically, of information.
Right.
And he was kind of laughed out of the room from a conventional science perspective, but you think there's something to it?
I'm not a gambler, but I would bet money there's something there.
I've always been sympathetic to it. Why do you think there's money there? And then I can tell you why I'm interested in it.
Experiments I've witnessed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Can you say anything more?
Unfortunately, no one. Forgive me, because I don't mean to be like I don't mean to be overly vague.
Well, I can speak for you. Have you ever heard of Konstantin Michels?
I have.
Okay, so he's in the Black Forest in Germany.
Yep.
And he deals with extended electrodynamics, but from a kind of biological systems perspective.
Right.
And he writes about DNA resonance with, specific scalar longitudinal waves. Actually, one of the scalar waves is called heliocoidal.
Right.
And so you might think, if form follows function, or function follows form, that, if you have these wave types that basically look like DNA, maybe they're meant for DNA to be the receivers.
Right.
And so there's also another guy named Andrei Puharich who was very interested in extended electrodynamics, or extremely low frequencies, and how they would affect kind of brain waves and even semantic information.
Right. And if I could say, I would dare to argue that all of what we've been discussing, from the propulsion aspect all the way to the communications, to the biological, to the energy aspect, all deal with these longitudinal waves in some capacity or another. There is a harmonic component. There's a sound component that has been completely removed from the teachings of electrical engineering, that in some aspects do exist in some institutions regarding particle physics, but it essentially deals with an asymmetry within space-time itself that you could induce. Through, for example, things like superconducting resonance circuits, they're tank circuits as they're called, and certain avenues going down that road. I do, forgive me, I do have to be careful, but yes, there may be some resonance, may be a significant aspect to all of this.
What is an aspect of this technology that we can speak about that you think will help the most amount of people and be the least dangerous as far as describing the actual nuts and bolts components of how it works? Because I'd love to get into how some of these things work close to the metal, but I realize they're, national security sensitivities. And you haven't told me anything, but what I picked up from, you came across, certain people entered your life, or you came on their radar or whatever, is that when maybe you got these interesting downloads around science, you were maybe tapped by people who are kind of in and around government circles.
Right.
Would be my guess, but
that is correct. Yes. What's interesting is that I think, without bringing it up too often, I think that Sal Paez's patents and his work have been by far the most revealing aspect of what propulsion could be applied to, with regards to essentially, again, reducing the mass of an object and so on. But I also think that this is where I'll be very blunt. I believe that this talk of metamaterials.
Mhm.
It's not that metamaterials are bad or don't work or are a psyop. Not at all. I think that they have a very fundamental place in the field of physics and materials engineering, absolutely. However, I think that there has been, and this is not towards any one individual in particular, but there has been a narrative pushed with respect to not discussing that you can use basic materials that we already have and have known about for decades, combined with electromagnetism to induce some of these effects, whether it's energy, communication, propulsion. I think it's because some of these solutions, again, taken with a certain perspective, with a different perspective on old physics, in some cases could be so simple to engineer. In some cases, if one had access to, a decent amount of funding, that it is threatening to people that are looking to suppress this.
So you think the alien narrative is sometimes tech protection?
I believe there is a legitimate aspect to it, but I think in some cases, yes.
So yeah, I hear that, and then it's just extremely confusing. Every
Right.
time I'm like, oh,
Right.
maybe it's just anti-gravity shit. I'm like,
Right.
I'll give you a good example. Okay.
Sure.
So like Townsend Brown is this mid-century
Right.
anti-gravity guy. I think he got like really far, made a documentary about him.
Right.
And
Which was great.
oh, thank you, man. And he, talks about a couple of materials. So magnesium bismuth, barium titanate.
Right.
They're what's called high K dielectrics.
Yeah.
So when you have a high K factor, you can store a lot of electromagnetic charge.
Right.
His experiment, which involves a capacitor, so negatively charged plate, positively charged plate.
Yep.
You have to put this neutral insulator in between,
Right.
and that has a high K. When it has a high K factor, you get more thrust. So you
Right.
pump electromagnetism into the whole thing, and you get this thrust from negative to positive.
Right.
And so, that in a way that beats gravity. So it's this exciting thing. So he talks about magnesium bismuth, barium titanate. And then I interviewed Gary Nolan too, Stanford professor. And he,
Right.
claims that he has UFO crash parts that he
Right.
received from Jacques Vallée, and it's magnesium bismuth.
Right. Right.
And so I'm like, well, maybe it's just anti-gravity or whatever.
Right, right.
But then you go deeper into Townsend Brown, you realize that he started NICAP, which is the first civilian UFO tracking program in 1956. You could say that was just, doing civilian counter intel for, like American anti-gravity crafts. But you learn about these early stories from around the time that like DARPA formed, like the late 50s, early 60s, where he would go into the field and find stuff, flash his credentials, do crash retrievals, basically. And like he found this green fireball thing and it was losing mass. And apparently that was barium titanate. And then he himself had a UFO experience that inspired a lot of his work, kind of like your thing.
Interesting.
So the whole thing gets weird, where
Right.
the second you're like, maybe it's just anti-gravity stuff, you trip out and you're like, I don't know. I think
it becomes, it starts to get very, very, to your point, it starts to get very, very interesting because I think that at this point in time, I think if there's a sighting of a UAP, I think that most of the time it's hard to tell if that is human made, whether the source of pure human ingenuity, or whether it's a little bit of that mixed with reverse engineering aspects, or if it's something or someone else entirely. What I will say though is I think we need to look into high voltage experiments that Tesla was playing with, that people these days seem to not be interested in. I think that
why high voltage?
I think high voltage induces a polarizable effect within the local vacuum wherever that voltage is being applied. For example, there was something called the Ebner effect, I believe in the 1990s. I can send you the details to this afterwards, dealing with essentially, there was a small documentary put together, I forgot from which country in Europe, but essentially when extremely high voltage, it was like 500,000 volts or more, were applied to crops, they were growing in ways that the farmers had not seen ever. And so I think this is where it starts to get, again, very esoteric, but the notion is that the ether or the quantum vacuum has within it memory that are stored within these potentials. And these potentials, when practically induced using high voltage, could in fact enable a form of vacuum polarization that can apply to biological systems, propulsive systems, communication systems, and so on and so forth in a way that we would not be able to detect or understand with our current means of technological development.
This is pretty freaky. It feels like playing God a little bit, because you're talking about how matter even comes to form or something in the first place. And like, it's interesting you say that about high voltages, 500,000 volts or whatever applied to plants. Townsend Brown was extremely interested in electroculture as well. And he lived
Right.
on Hawaii and would do all these experiments around, having plants grow in specific ways with
Right.
electroculture.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I look at the work of Townsend Brown and Tesla, and they're very similar. Like what Tesla was doing at Wardenclyffe, high voltages, short distances,
Right.
where he's claiming to tap the ether for free energy, seems to be somewhat similar to what Townsend Brown is doing.
I agree. And I think one of the things, as we discussed earlier before we started recording, is that I think one of the concerns for groups or elements that don't want this to be discussed or come out is that, or be disclosed in any capacity, is that once you open this can of worms, it opens up a whole other set of discoveries that people would otherwise not know, that people would generally not notice unless they knew that there's a form of asymmetry in the vacuum using potentials that could be induced to create what is called higher symmetry electromagnetics using a vector and scalar potentials. And so I think that what starts happening is you start dealing with things like, again, negative energy, so cold electricity, so cold currents, for example, so you get frostbite. If you were to touch a wire with it with cold currents rather than, as normally now you get burned if you touch a wire that's got electrical currents.
Would that allow, because I think about extremely cold, circuits or materials.
Right.
And you hear this theory that maybe, UFOs or man-made,
Right.
crafts or whatever that exhibit these exotic flight principles might be sort of acting like quantum macroscopic objects.
I agree.